Grays Reef National Marine Sanctuary is one of 14 sites within the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, which is under NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, located about 20 miles offshore of the middle of the Georgia's coast and about 70 feet underneath the surface. Grays Reef is considered subtropical because we're not exactly tropical, but we're not exactly temperate either. We're right in that cusp. So I call it a crossroads because we get species that are coming up from the tropics. We're the northern range for tropical species. We're the southern range for species that are coming off of that mid-Atlantic area in the temperate waters. We're also that offshore limit for inshore species such as sheepshead, and we're that inshore limit for species that are coming, say, from 300 feet of water like amberjack. When you dive Grays Reef, oftentimes the visibility is not that great. We have a lot of particulate matter in the water column, so the visibility is greatly reduced. But that's the good news. We have an abundance of phytoplankton and zooplankton, the little tiny organisms that are the basis for the food chain. Well, those little tiny organisms feed bigger organisms, and those bigger organisms are food in turn for larger organisms, and so you can just go right on up the food pyramid. Well, this is an incredibly productive area. As a matter of fact, I call the waters a rich nutrient soup. And that's because we have an abundance of marsh here. The marshes provide a lot of nutrients and sediments that come out off the coast that are transported by the water system, in particular the rivers that feed onto the Georgia coast. We have to manage our resource, and one of the ways that we determine whether or not we have a healthy environment is by looking at the water quality. We have tests that tell us if there are contaminants that are present, and sure enough there are. Because Grays Reef is 20 miles offshore, it has the buffering capacity of that 20 miles so that contaminants that are coming out of the watershed are not directly influencing Grays Reef. That water actually flows southward before it actually comes back up, pushed up by the sea breezes, which is where Grays Reef is located. But we know that the contaminants are there because we look at the little tiny organisms called benthic infauna, that's the big name, but those are little tiny worms and brittle stars and clams that live in the sand, and we look at the load in their tissues of those contaminants, and they're there. So that's concerning, that is of concern to us.
We're going to be conducting a dye study out in the Altamaha Sound to look at the potential for how the watershed of the Altamaha Sound can influence the resources that we're trying to protect at Grays Reef.
The initial conception of this project was about 2.5 years ago, and so it was shortly after that that we wrote the original proposal. So we were contacted by the EPA, and they basically called us and asked us if we were going to start looking at connectivity between upland systems and offshore reefs, what would be the first thing that we would do? And what did we tell them?
We told them that we'd try to trace the water from the rivers out offshore, and to do that we'd have to use some kind of dye or particle or something that we could follow along and sample as we go.
The site where we plan to drop the dye is about 20-mile run from the mouth of the Wilmington River all the way down to Sapelo Sound. So we have to leave pretty early in the morning. Plus, we want to be able to track the dye for a long period of time.
Drugs. Oh no.
Oh crap.
Oh,
We might be leaking a little bit.
I don't know where that one leaked from.
Everybody ready to go? Time to set sail.
The forecast for the mission doesn't look very good. There's a cold front moving in, and with that we expect to have high winds and high seas.
Conditions are not exactly ideal today. It is October, and the conditions are always they just vary. So you don't know from one day to the next. The forecasts change very rapidly.
The conditions aren't the best today. We've probably got about 2 to 3 foot seas, white caps.
We aren't that far offshore, so we're not quite sure exactly what's going to happen once we get there. We'll just have to. We're playing this one by ear to see if the conditions will allow us to actually do the study. So right now we're at the mercy of nature.
We've all stocked up on our seasick medication so that we can handle this. And part of the problem with going out right now is that the water's coming up over the back of the boat, so there's a lot of spray and it's tough to move around back there. And that's something that we have to think about when we want to do our sampling, because how are we supposed to lean over and get water samples if there's the risk of somebody just tumbling over the water, over the side into the water. So it's a little dicey right now, so we're just kind of hoping that it will calm down enough so that we can do what we need to do.
Water samples now, Reese?
Are we at the drop site?
Are we at the site, Greg?
We are very close.
It's exciting, but we have no idea what's going to happen.
We also had an instrument on board called a CTD, which is just short for conductivity, temperature, and depth. And from those parameters you can compute the salinity of the water. And the salinity was important because we had suspended the dye in salt water, but we didn't know exactly what the salinity of the water in the sound would be. So the implications of that are that if we put the dye in a concentration that was too heavy, if you will, and we poured it into fresher water, it might sink directly to the bottom.
It's on. Just kind of make sure I don't go overboard. Okay, it's in the water.
Like being a manual winch.
Yeah, right? All right, Danny. If you could help me get this over the...
30 on the surface and 35 on the bottom.
Was what?
The salinity, 30 on the
30,
surface
35?
and 35 on the bottom.
All right.
So I don't know what this was configured for. It may
Well,
go
we ought to
somewhere.
take one as soon as we drop
It's
it.
seawater, standard seawater 36.
Yeah.
It's going to the bottom.
Okay.
We don't even know if we're going to be able to release the dye because of the waves. If the waves are hitting the side of the boat, could make it very precarious on the back deck trying to release the dye into the water. The other thing we don't know is whether or not the dye will dissolve readily into seawater. We have it suspended right now in seawater, but we're not certain whether or not it's just going to sink right to the bottom when we pour it in.
Yeah, my hands are going to be stained again.
You would have thought the couple parts of the job would get the lid off.
Oh!
Wow.
What are we going to do with these things once I do them?
Scientists can make the biggest messes.
See the trail.
Is there? Where's
out to sea.
When we released the dye into the water, I think the response from almost everybody was, "Oh my God," because the dye was so much more visible and fluorescent than we ever thought it would be. In fact, it was so concentrated red that it almost looked purple.
I guess we're doing this then, huh? I think we're done.
It looks like we've been slaughtering lambs out here or something.
We're expecting to be able to follow the dye for most of the day.
I don't know what else you can ask for. I mean, the stuff really works.
We've planned it such that it's going to be released on an outgoing tide, which should carry the dye plume far out to sea. We don't know how far out to sea. We're hoping that the plume will at least clear the sound, and then we'll be able to follow it as it tracks offshore.
Well, I guess we'll find out.
The dye that we released is moving in towards the shallow water, and we had hoped to be able to take periodic samples in the dye plume as it dispersed, but now it's in water that's so shallow that we can't get to it.
The dye was moving towards the southern bank of Sapelo Sound, which concerned us a lot, because we were afraid that if the dye moved up close to the bank that it would get trapped in the sand, and we would lose a lot of our ability to be able to track the dye. Plus, we were a little concerned that we might be staining the beach pink.
Are we starting to get outside the bars now a little bit?
Yeah, starting to get out.
So it's starting to make it off.
I'm going kind of east-southeast right now.
Okay. Well, what we've decided to do now is we've decided to terminate operations for today because the conditions are starting to get a little worse.
Originally, we had decided to track the dye for a 24-hour period and see how close it came to the area of Gray's Reef. But as it turned out, because the seas were so bad and the waves were so rough, we weren't able to make it offshore. In fact, we barely made it out of the Sound and had a very rough ride going back home. Here we are leaving at 4:30 in the morning and getting out on site, getting beat up on the way down there. People are seasick. And you're constantly having to fight the motion of the boat all day long. And then you have to turn around and beat back through the waves in order to go back home. So it's a very challenging environment and an aspect of being a marine biologist that I just don't think a lot of people think about.
We'll be able to modify things and come out and do this again in the spring. And I think really have a good idea of how we want to do this to get even more valuable information.
But the reason we should care why Gray's Reef is out there and why it needs to remain healthy is because it is a productive resource. You know, everything is connected to everything else. So if you've got a healthy fish population or several healthy fish populations, that means that the whole ecosystem in general is going to be healthy too. You know, when you're diving the reef, you do see a lot of human impact, and one of the most visible things that you see, that you notice, are debris, marine debris. The transport of the contaminants come out of the watershed. I'm talking nutrients and pesticides, fertilizers that people put on their yards, put on their farms, the crops, but also the exhaust, the oils, the petroleum-based materials that are coming from out of the exhaust of people's cars. It's industrial waste too, that gets washed down from the land by the rain, follows into those various waterways, and eventually makes its way to the larger rivers, those 6 freshwater rivers that then feed onto the Georgia coast, feed out into the ocean. One of the best things that we can do is perhaps not even have a lawn, just use natural plants that don't even need watering, that don't need fertilizers and pesticides. Just go natural. But if you do have a lawn, you know, because your neighborhood says you have to have a lawn and it has to be pretty, well, then you can choose the right products. You can choose products that are environmentally friendly, that biodegrade, and don't cause an algal blooms because there's too many nutrients that are being put into the system. So wise choice, and all of that information is out there. It's just a matter of taking responsibility and understanding that your actions are directly responsible for the health of your watersheds and your ocean.